The Prime Minister has served a muscular message of resolve of a kind this generation hasn't seen, of a kind which surpassed anything observers in India or internationally may have anticipated. The question I'm hoping to look at on the Newstrack tonight is, where are we going next? This speech will have consequences. What can those consequences be? And what will happen next in this confrontation? For a military perspective, joining me on this broadcast is one of our most respected generals, Lieutenant General Syed Hasnain. Welcome, Mr. General Hasnain. For a strategic affairs perspective, I'm joined by Brahma Chalani, one of our leading scholars on China, has been hugely critical of the government, has said so far. Now, finally, he seems to be believing that the government's found its voice. I'm joined for a diplomatic perspective by Vijay Nambiar. He's been our ambassador in China, highly respected diplomat. For an international perspective, I'm joined by Professor Vipin Narang. He's at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This week, he's written an article, a very important research paper in War on the Rocks, which is a military war and foreign policy journal, where he talks about India's consequences, China's response, and what could potentially happen from here on. And for a political perspective on the thinking within the ruling BJP, I'm joined by Mahesh Jetmalani. I want to go across to General Syed Hasnain first. General Hasnain, your sense of how this speech will be interpreted by the boys on the ground, the troops to whom the speech was delivered, the Army, the Air Force, the ITBP. What's the kind of electrifying message that's likely to have gone through the ranks because the Prime Minister came and met them and spoke to them in the way that he did?
See, Rahul, there's no doubt that troops on the ground are always anticipating a visit by a senior political personality, a leader of the nation. But this kind of a visit, secretly, suddenly taking you by surprise and appearing there in the front line with the troops, it sends home a message of a different kind. And we got to admit that this visit has actually been a transformational kind of a visit because of the surprise factor which it has maintained. That's number one. Every one of us will have our own takeaways from this, but I look at it essentially as something with two particular aspects of his speech. One is the fact that he referred to Lord Krishna's flute and the Sudarshan Chakra. I think that is kind of an appeal to troops is tremendous. You know, at the same time, hard power, at the same time, peace. This peace is what India professes. We will always look for peace, but if someone does a provocation, someone does coercion, we will always be prepared for it. That's some kind of message which the troops always love. The second message is about mothers. He actually related Mother India to the mothers of all the soldiers who are serving there. In fact, to every Indian Jawan. Now that's again an amazing kind of a message where you relate your own mother to the nation, to Mother India. I think the troops must have taken this very, very, very positively. Okay. But if I may just add one more point to it, and that is the strategic element to this speech was also a single takeaway from me, and that was this whole aspect of the end of expansionism. The end of expansionism and the rise of development and peace. I think these were the two amazing messages which came out.
Okay, let's now look forward, General Hasnain. If an Indian political leader has delivered the kind of speech that Prime Minister Modi did in the midst of this intense confrontation with China, what do you see happen next? Because it's too much for us to assume that China will suddenly change its plans and pull back. That's unlikely to happen. Therefore, what do you see happening from here on? Are we in for a long, prolonged standoff, or are you anticipating a military escalation?
I would say that firstly, the speech itself has galvanized the nation. I hope very strongly political consensus emerges behind the armed forces, behind the political leadership. That's number one. Number two, China itself responded to the speech, and within 2 hours, 3 hours, we found the Chinese coming on television. Obviously, the Chinese were taken by surprise. I do anticipate that the Chinese would be standing back and looking at this, reviewing this. In fact, reviewing their entire strategy. I do not think this is going to lead to any major escalation. But the fact that there is a standoff and troops are there on the ground, separated by a couple of meters only, the chances are always there of a trigger happening at some place or the other, something like what happened at Galwan. And that anticipation I do have. But that any kind of a major escalation leading to a warlike condition, a border war or something like that, I don't anticipate that.
Okay.
I do think that November is the period, July to November, 4 months from now. This is the period through which China will play its narrative out. It's a very strong message it is trying to give to the world. And the world is all observing it. And there's no doubt about it that most of the world is actually siding with India on this. The Chinese are on the back foot diplomatically. There's no doubt about it. But the Chinese will not relent, because relenting at this stage after having gone so far will send a very, very negative message about their capability to take it beyond.
Brahmachalani, you were of the view that the Prime Minister in his last address hadn't signaled intent. He's done more than just that right now. What did you make of his speech today? More importantly, what do you think will happen next?
Modi's speech underscores India's resolve to drive back China's encroachments. The issue is, can a speech alone beat back China's aggression? India is talking about restoration of status quo ante, which itself is recognition of the changed status quo on the ground. Negotiations will not get India status quo ante. In fact, since the negotiations began between the senior commanders on June 6th, you've had fresh Chinese encroachments on Indian territories. For example, the PLA has encroached now on the Devsang Plateau's Y Junction, the so-called bottleneck. Also, the June 15th clash site, which both the PMO and the MEA said was on the Indian side of the LSC. That site today is under PLA control. The PLA is using negotiations with India to buy time, to consolidate its hold on the newly encroached areas, to build permanent structures, to open new pressure points against India. So we have to look ahead. The longer this standoff lasts, the more unlikely the Chinese will roll back their encroachments.
So what do you think will happen next? Use all the experience of India and China that you have at your disposal, Brahmachalani, and tell our viewers what you think is most likely to happen on the back of this big address and the Prime Minister's visit to the troops in Leh.
I think we should just look at our own experience in 2017 when we decided to disengage in Doklam Plateau. We withdrew. The Chinese pretended they would withdraw, but within weeks, they occupied the entire Doklam Plateau, other than the standoff site, by building permanent structures. Now, these permanent structures that they built included heated shelters for their troops to survive in the winter months. They're doing the same thing in the Galwan Valley. They're doing the same thing in Lake Pangong area today. They are building fortified bunkers, observation posts, ammunition dumps, new tracks, for example, in the Galwan Valley. All this indicates that they are there to stay. They are there not to negotiate and withdraw. So we have to face up to the truth. We have been trying to obscure the ground situation for weeks on end. We were pretending that the situation is under control. All is fine, until the lid lifted with the June 15th clashes. Since the June 15th clashes, things have worsened with fresh encroachments. And I think Modi's speech and Modi's trip to the Ladakh front was significant. But we have to look beyond a visit and a speech. What leverage does India bring to force China to withdraw? How can India create counter leverage? And why are we always talking about Chinese incursions? Why have there been no Indian incursions on Chinese claimed territory? How do we negotiate if we bring nothing if he plays nothing on the negotiating table.
Okay, let Mahesh Jethmalani on behalf of the BJP try and respond to some of this. A, that the government so far was wishy-washy, unwilling to accept that there was a problem. That blew up post-Galwan. And even now, if you're seeking a restoration of status quo ante without first accepting that status quo ante has been disturbed and disrupted, then you're not being fully truthful. Mahesh Jethmalani, your sense of what the Prime Minister was signalling and your response to the criticism coming the BJP's way.
Well, first, what the Prime Minister was signaling, the Prime Minister certainly, it was a rallying cry for our troops. It was to raise the morale of the entire nation and to assure it that the security of the country and its territorial integrity was safe, that the army was fully prepared. It was a rousing speech, and all the military people on the show have told you that it served the purpose of stirring up the army, and undoubtedly it would have firmed up their resolve and made them ready to do battle if necessary. And thirdly, of course, it was a strong message to China that we are not going to take any intrusion lying down. We are fully prepared, and we are meeting you eyeball to eyeball. And if there is any further intrusions into this area, there was an intrusion which was rebuffed. That's the stand of the government and the army at the moment, that the moment there was an intrusion, it was rebuffed. The word status quo ante is a word used by Brahmachalani. Now, status quo ante can mean a lot of things in any event, but I don't want to be fuzzy about the whole thing. The issue at the moment is that there's a huge military buildup, particularly in Galwan Valley, in the Finger area, and in Pangong So, in the lake area. So in those three areas, it's a worrying buildup. There are more than 10,000 troops. It's the most unusual step. And Brahmachalani is perhaps misinterpreting the fact that the Indians are now battle prepared is a sign that there's an intrusion. And he uses the word status quo ante. My view is that we are worried about Chinese intentions from this massive military buildup. Are they up to some mischief? Or equally in the Gilgit-Baltistan area, there's a Pakistani buildup. So a combination of these factors has to make India extremely prepared. We have to watch them with eagle eyes and make sure that there is no intrusion. Any intrusion, is the Prime Minister's message, will be rebuffed with disproportionate force.
Status quo ante is not my term. Status quo ante is a term used by the government of India in its official statements on the border situation.
The Ministry of External Affairs has often said that there must be a restoration of status quo ante. Okay, Sanjay Jha, we would have expected that there be some kind of political unity on a day when the Prime Minister has sent such a strong message from the high altitude of Ladakh. Instead, what we see from the Congress is a continuation of the carping and the criticism. Can we not put politics on this matter for a hold, at least for a short while?
Rahul, I understand where you're coming from, but, let me put the facts on the table right at the very beginning. National security, foreign policy, territorial boundaries, these are not the prerogative of any political party or a government in power. We are all stakeholders. It doesn't matter whether we have got 52 MPs or another party has got 20. It doesn't make any difference. The fundamental point that we need to understand, and I'm going to quote to you the Indian ambassador to China. The Indian ambassador to China, called Mr. Vikram Mishri, who incidentally also happens to be in my business school. He went on record to say just the other day that the Chinese were in the Indian side of the line of actual control. Now, why is it that, this government of Mr. Modi, which has got a track record of being the most opaque and sinister in terms of manipulating data and information, is actually trying to, at this point of time, which is so sensitive, especially with a militarily aggressive definitely intruding into our territories, playing these, what I call is smokes and mirrors games. You're a seasoned politicalist, and I want to this fact here that at this point, all political parties, I believe, and there are some things some leaders have said I don't approve of, but I do believe that India has a mature political consensus. But to ask the government that why have you, when Mr. Rajnath Singh, the defense minister, said thousands of Chinese have entered into India. On Galwan Valley, the Prime Minister does the 56-inch chest thumping, playing to the domestic, huge gallery of his that nobody's crossed into the Indian territory, actually giving the Chinese a handle to make a claim on Galwan Valley. I think that is a monumental, mammoth diplomatic, political disaster for which the Prime Minister himself needs to speak up.
So he has spoken. After that, so even if the first message, no, 1 second, Sanjay Jha, even if the first message was defensive and muddled, there was no ambiguity in what the Prime Minister said today. This is the strongest declaration of intent any Indian political leader has demonstrated publicly against China, bar none.
Well, I want to make a short point here. You know, Mr. Modi's rhetorical flamboyance is legendary. Can it get the lives of the 20 soldiers who were brutalized to death? Can it get them back? It's like, it reminds me of what Mr. Modi said in his second lockdown speech, if I remember. It was smacking of, such brazen triumphalism. We have done better than the rest of the world, and India is on the way to, proving it wrong. Look where we are today. I think Mr. Modi's speeches are given far too much exaggerated importance. I don't think anybody in this country is not standing up for the army. I agree they need to be motivated. Nobody is criticizing Mr. Modi's content of his speech today in Ladakh. But you know what? Politics and foreign policy is actually ground reality. You've got to recognize that we are at the moment checkmated. Can we fight a two-front war? I'm hearing a lot of nationalists coming on TV channels and saying that China is on a decline and we can take a two-front war. I think they need to get their heads examined. Okay. Vipin Narang, sitting where you are in the United States, how do you think this speech will be viewed internationally?
Hi, Rahul. Thanks for having me. Prime Minister Modi's political instincts are second to none, and I view the speech much along the lines as Brahma, who I've disagreed with in the past on many things, but I think he's absolutely right here. This was largely for domestic political consumption. It, certainly boosted the morale of the troops who may be deployed on the LAC for a long time, and there was a rally around the flag effect. It did demonstrate resolve. It was a clear signal of national resolve against the Chinese. But resolve in and of itself doesn't produce results. And the fundamental question still remains, which is how are the Indians going to induce the Chinese to disengage? And regardless of whether the Chinese have made incursions onto quote unquote Indian territory, there has been a substantial change to the status quo on the ground that gives the Chinese tactical advantages in multiple places across the LAC, and in aggregate pose a significant strategic challenge to India's position in Ladakh. And so, the options that India faces and the government faces are not great. So you either have to prosecute a limited conflict to expel the Chinese directly, open up other fronts elsewhere where the Chinese have certainly by now defended any vulnerabilities they may have, or one has to accept it and then risk the chance that you've emboldened the dragon, so to speak. And so the speech itself was, a good necessary step, I think, for domestic politics and for the troops who are deployed, forward deployed. But it doesn't change the facts on the ground. And I think the Chinese, once the applause and the drama dies down of the speech, will look at the facts on the ground and agree that time benefits them. And the fact that the Chinese have not been terribly interested in disengagement negotiations and are stalling for time, to me suggests that they are playing for the long haul, consolidating their positions, which will make it much more difficult to dislodge them. And the options facing the Indian government are very poor. The time to resist fait accomplis are before they're accompli. And now that the Chinese hold these positions, they're not just going to pack up and go home.
Vijay Nambiar, what's your sense of how this speech is likely to play out in diplomatic circles? We saw today India reach out to Japan. We've seen support from the United States, from France. What's your sense of how internationally pressure is being made to bear on China, not just because of its military confrontation with India, but also because of its aggressive postures in the South China Sea?
I think that by making this visit today, Prime Minister Modi has actually diplomatically also raised the stakes considerably. At this level to go, I think it's not just for it's not only for domestic reasons. Of course, it has to for domestic reasons, and it has to have a morale boosting effect. But it also raises the stake diplomatically. It shows resolve. It's actually a direct challenge to the wolf warrior kind of approach, which the ground forces commander, Xu Qiling, has been. In fact, his cachet is the famous Mao quote of Zhuzheng Zhaoxi, which is "seize the day, seize the hour." I think the message diplomatically also is that kind of thing is not going to be acceptable, because it will be difficult, but we are going to hold firmly. Now, the question is, while you make your firm declaration of resolve, is this question of the expansionism, be coping with expansionism, is that going to be, how is that going to be tackled? And that's the point which some of your experts have been talking about, whether it will make any difference on the ground. I think, even though I don't know whether at this stage holding back or escalating it is something which will be immediately advisable at this stage, I think that just the message that has been sent of resolve and the international repercussions, the reverberations it has been having, Japan is one example. More than that, the Chinese leadership have taken note of it. In fact, the spokesman has actually already commented, indirectly at least. The Chinese leadership will have a meeting this month, in the coming weeks, at Beidaihe. Whether it's a virtual meeting or a direct meeting, one doesn't know. But I'm sure that this will have reverberations in the leadership itself. And I think it's not going to be just a question of they're leaving it to the commanders at this stage to hold forth.
As our former ambassador in Beijing, what's your sense of the thinking within the Chinese political leadership, given the fact that Xi Jinping now runs the Communist Party, runs the Central Military Commission, and is the president of China? Would he at this point, in your view, want to seek an escalation? Because when you're fighting at a time when you're trying to project yourself as a superpower, getting engaged in a stalemate with India does China's international image no good?
Yes, but actually raising the stakes also is not, or all over the world. I think all around, raising the stakes at this stage with India is also not going to do that much good to the Chinese general image around the world. I think China in this particular, I think that there has been a credibility problem which the Chinese have actually suffered. And I think it is being seen internationally. The question of insisting on ambiguity in the LAC and then, making a change and then not responding to diplomatic efforts to get back to the status quo ante. I think the whole world is seeing this. So if this is active defense, I think that the mask has come out of this kind of active defense of China. And I think while it may be possible for them to be able to hold out, I think it was going to cause grievous damage to their international image. And I think diplomatically...
So now, broadly, here's where we are at. The Indian and the Chinese armies are in confrontation. We can let the situation be, dig in for the long haul. We can accept status quo or try and evict the Chinese militarily. How will these three scenarios likely play out? We'll discuss this with the guests that we have, and what's interesting is that they bring so much varied perspective, from an international perspective, a diplomatic perspective, a strategic perspective, a military perspective. So I'll come back and I'll look at that crucial question of what happens next.
Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kamal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.